I learn something new about Shimano every time I cruise its website. My latest piece of knowledge is what they call Q factor.
Oh, Hottie, you don't cruise websites, you surf. You surf the web. But, okay, tell me what this Q factor is, since you're going to get technical on me no matter what.
Right. Actually, I don't know where the term comes from when it relates to cycling. I do know if you Google Q factor definition, you will get some crazy physics engineering explanation. So don't do that. In cycling, it relates to the distance between your crank arms. In other words, how wide a stance your crankset creates.
Yeah, okay, I'm with you. I do know that on my road bike, I feel like I have, a narrower pedal stance than when I'm on my mountain bike. So what does this have to do with Shimano?
Well, Shimano, of course, makes cranks, and Shimano knows that people have different anatomies, which is why you will find in their selection of mountain bike cranks different Q factors. Not surprisingly, Shimano's XTR XC crank is their narrowest. XC is more pedaling focused, and for that, most riders want to feel like the pedals are more directly under them, more like a road bike.
Yeah, and for enduro types who spend more time out of the saddle, that wider stance can really help you feel a little more stable, and that's why you're going to find an XTR Enduro crank in Shimano's lineup. So I am starting to get this Q factor thing.
I know, it's kind of fun, isn't it? Hey, make sure you have the right pedaling stance for your Leadville 100, and if you need something different, check out Shimano's cranks at bike.shimano.com, and thanks to Shimano for being the title sponsor of this show.
3, 2, 1.
Leadville, the podcast for the 100-mile mountain bike race presented by Shimano. Find them at bike.shimano.com. It is season 6, episode 19 of the show that breaks down, builds up, gets you ready, and freaks you out for the highest, hardest one-day mountain bike race in the country. I am Michael Hotton, Hottie to most.
And I am Fatty. Earlier in this season, we told you how to use heat to help you with your endurance training. In this episode, we're going to tell you to cool off. Even though Leadville is not regarded as a race where extreme heat is a problem on race day, the fact of the matter is your body is producing heat that can limit performance.
Yeah, maybe you've seen racers go for a small pack of ice down the back or an icy drink to try and cool things off. In this show, we aim to figure out what's going on there, and to explain, we have back the medical chief for the EF Pro Cycling team, Dr. Kevin Sprouse.
What is a good strategy for staying ahead of the cutoff times?
What do the experts say about sleeping effectively at altitude, and what do you each do?
For Leadville, hardtail or full suspension?
Yeah, good question.
Leadville frequently asked questions, LFAQs for short. We put the free in frequently by charging absolutely nothing for this valuable Leadville advice.
Well, the whole show is free, so we are being consistent.
Okay, our question this episode comes from Edward Gray on our Slack channel. He says, hey, I'm getting ready for my first Leadville this year and have some crewing questions. He says, my wife will be my crew, and we are planning to have her meet me at Pipeline, followed by Twin Lakes outbound, and then reverse on the way back. Our tentative plan is to avoid me having to carry a hydration pack and 2 water bottles for some segment. For those that have used the cruise shuttles, is it reasonable to expect her to be able to get from Pipeline to Twin Lakes before me, assuming a 10-hour finish time goal? Any other crewing tips, he asked? We are assuming that tracking me via GPS will not be reliable. Before I get my overly worded answer going, Fatty, if you had just one person to cover your needs, how would you deploy them?
This sounded so much like a high school math problem. I was starting to get sweaty palms. But here's what I would do. I would put drop bags, first of all, at Pipeline and Columbine. And that way I am safe no matter what. I have bad weather gear and a couple of tubes. And then I would put my crew right at the Twin Lakes Dam. And here's why. I generally don't need anything when I get to Pipeline the first time because the day is still pretty cool. So I haven't been drinking a ton yet. I've only been out a couple hours. I for sure am not out of food. So I am happy to have my first stop be at mile 40 with the knowledge that just, if things have gone wrong, I do have emergency stuff at every aid station. So for the first pass through at Twin Lakes, mile 40, I would swap out my USWE pack and get enough food to get me back up, up to Columbine and back down. And at the second Twin Lakes meetup, I'd get my hydration pack back and an empty bottle in a cage and just plan to fill that bottle at Carter if necessary. Now, Hottie, you're going to notice that I'm saying Twin Lakes instead of Twin Lakes alternate here. Because if I'm going to be skipping Pipeline inbound, I want to have my inbound Twin Lakes feed as late as possible in the race, and even a couple of miles later is a good thing for me. So I know you love alternate, but I would push it all the way to the regular Twin Lakes aid station. Regardless, I would make a game time decision as I came through Pipeline inbound, whether I needed to use that aid station at all to fill an empty bottle or, if it's a hot day. And if it is, then it's worth carrying that extra pound up power line. If it's an overcast day, I would just ride through and see at Carter. People forget about the Carter neutral aid station, but it is very valuable if you need a quick drink to get you through that final hour or so of the race.
Yeah, Ed got a lot of responses on our Slack channel, I think, but most of them assumed the hopscotching crew would have a car. If your crew is relying on the shuttles, I'd send them straight to Twin Lakes alternate in the morning. Twin Lakes is a really important stop. You're trying to dump weight there and refresh, right? So that's a really important place to be. You can actually, as Fatty said, skip having a crew at Pipeline outbound. I mean, ultimately, I love covering all 4 stops with people if you can, but you can skip Pipeline outbound. And if you really do need it, there is neutral there, even in the morning. After the descent of Columbine and refuel, your solo shuttle-dependent crew could attempt to get to Pipeline for a meetup there. But you need a backup plan. If your crew doesn't make it, there's got to be a plan B.
Yeah.
And remember, this leg, Pipeline to the finish, is long. You need full bottles and or a hydration pack or an option to stop at Carter, as Fatty said. A backup plan could be riding Twin Lakes alternate to Pipeline with 1 full bottle, an empty bottle, and an empty hydration pack. So you lose the weight, but still have, right, the capacity there. Mm-hmm. If your crew fails to show, you could at least fill yourself at the neutral aid. And if you have enough equipment, as Fatty said, you could send a bag to Pipeline neutral aid and let that be your plan B. If, again, your crew doesn't show, the shuttle crew. With a car, this is much more doable and possible to cover all 4 stops, in fact. CJ and Jackson Wiggins, the brothers we had on the show earlier this season, they had their crew meet them at Pipeline, then Twin Lakes, then Pipeline. Mm-hmm. They had a car, and the brothers were basically on equal time, so they were able to do that. If I were doing this, I would use Twin Lakes alternate, and I would still have that plan B going at Pipeline.
Yep. I think probably what I would really recommend is something between what we said, and that is you're saying you just have the crew at the one place. There are a lot of people who just have one person there. Make a friend and arrange for zone defense, right? Your crew stays at Twin Lakes or Twin Lakes alternate. I mean, I agree with you that it is the calmer, kind of easier place to find your crew and have have your friends, crew at Pipeline, and everyone is going to find the right people at the right time without any concerns of where they're going to do it. So split things up. There are enough people, you can find someone to work with you. Use our Slack channel to arrange it.
I've made that jump as a crew member from Twin Lakes alternate, back to Pipeline and met my riders. And the riders are fairly spaced out. So again, it's possible. I had a car. I wasn't relying on the shuttles. It's doable, but again, I think you want the backup plan just in case.
One thing about our friends at Envy, they may make the very best carbon wheels and components, but when it comes to tooting their own horn, let's just say they're not using a very big horn. Take it from a guy who works on messaging and promoting for a living. Envy keeps it modest.
Yeah, they do. So allow us to do a little tooting. Did you know Envy wheels are under the top UCI downhill team, Commensal? That's right, the current men's World Cup champ, Amaury Perron, and two-time world champ Miriam Nicole both ride Envy. This year's Tour of Flanders winner, Tadej Pogacar, and his UAE Pro Tour team, they're on Envy. 24-time Leadville finisher, Eldon Fatty Nelson, he rolls around on Envy. So there you go, Envy. A little horn tooting for you.
I appreciate you including me with that actually talented bunch. Look, Envy is not shy in general. They are just incredibly consumed with engineering, testing, and building the best wheels in the business. So some of the promotional stuff, maybe not as important to them, which is why they have us, I guess. So Envy's success at the highest level is one of the reasons we tell you to ride their wheels. Envy's championship pedigree means riders like you and me have the very best wheels rolling underneath us as we crest the Sugarloaf climb, rip that lone single track section, and then fly down the GO Trail.
For your best day at Leadville, get the best wheels. The wheels that many of the world's fastest riders trust, and that's Envy. Check them out at envy.com. That's ENVE.com.
The start of the Leadville 100 can often have you shivering. It is low 40s or colder at the start and in the low 30s as you drop out of town. And as you ride that section, you may say to yourself, why would Hottie and Fatty spend a whole episode talking about how to cool off? I am plenty cool. The fact is your core temperature will climb. In fact, it will not be long until you start to feel very warm indeed.
Yeah, warming up is actually the easy part. Cooling down, especially your core, is much more of a challenge, but it's one worth considering since heat can tear into your ability to put out watts. For help keeping you cool, we have brought back someone who has dealt with pro riders battling it out in the biggest stage races in the world, often in scorching heat. We want to thank The Feed for coordinating our interview with EF Pro Cycling Dr. Kevin Sprouse as he explains how we can manage the heat produced as we push our bodies over the climbs of the Leadville Trail 100. Well, we want to welcome back to the show Dr. Kevin Sprouse. Dr. Kevin Sprouse was great to be on the show last season. I hope all you folks know he works with EF Pro Cycling. He's their chief medical guy, doctor. If a rider on that team has a problem, medically speaking, they go to Dr. Sprouse and say, Doc, help. I'm not feeling good. It's not working good. And of course, he is proactive too with those riders and checks in with them, make sure everything is going fine with them, medically speaking. Today, we've brought Dr. Sprouse on to talk about a topic that really caught my eye, in particular during last year's race, I would say, Dr. Sprouse, when I was asked to hand up a pantyhose full of ice cubes and hand it to a rider. Kristen Legan, actually, very good rider. She was in the Grand Prix, and I was helping her partner out with her feed at Twin Lakes. And I handed her up an ice pack, and she put it down the back of her shirt and rode off. And I looked at that as she rode away and went, what's that all about anyhow? What's this cooling off thing about? And of course, eventually you come across a word called thermoregulation, which is a great big word, and I love to throw it around. Makes me sound smart, but I'm really not. So, Dr. Sprouse, the doctor, what the hell is thermoregulation?
Well, thank you for having me back on. And this is a topic that I think is a really interesting one. In fact, it's one that we've been really in all the sports that I work in has been front and center of our performance planning because summers are hot and they're only getting hotter. And because of that, the temperatures in which we compete become more and more of a limiter, more and more of a determinant of who does well in the race, right? So whether you're recreational or competing for the podium, how you set yourself up to deal with the heat is hugely important. And that's really what thermoregulation is. It's having a strategy to regulate your core temperature to work best in a hot or cold environment. Thermoregulation as a term is agnostic to hot, cold, whatever, but we're talking heat here. So it's maintaining a relatively cool core temperature.
Yeah, I think I've read that temperature is your primary limiting factor for performance. So Fatty and I talk a lot about nutrition on the show and staying hydrated, but it's interesting to note that how heat or your core body temperature can be the thing that starts slowing you down. But what about at altitude? Dr. Sprouse, we're racing at 10,000 feet. Leadville is cool, very cool in the morning and nice during the days, 70, 75. Isn't the natural environment keeping me cool?
It is to some degree. I don't know that I would agree that temperature is the number one limiter to performance. That was probably said with well-meaning by someone who researches temperature. And if you ask someone about electrolytes or psychology or anything else, they're all going to say, this is the number one thing. But it's a significant one. And there's probably a case to be made for it being number one. So if it's on the top 5 and you're not paying attention to it, you're probably leaving some performance on the table. When you go to a race like Leadville, it's cool in the morning. It's even cold for a Southerner like me. I mean, I'm in a puffy coat and a toboggan. I have no hair, so that doesn't help. But I get just totally bundled up. At altitude, as the sun starts to come up, it's pretty intense from a heating standpoint. Even when the temperature isn't that high, you get a little bit more of the thermal effect from the sun. But more importantly, it's a hard race and it's a long race and your body is creating heat. So even though the environment could be perceived as one that is fairly moderate, the amount of heat you're producing internally is pretty significant. And a lot of folks, because it's cool in the morning, tend to overdress. And it can be a little too long in the race before they start to shed layers because they feel okay otherwise. And if your core temperature has drifted up, you may be having a bit of a foot on the brake, so to speak, because of that. So it is important at a race like Leadville. And again, as the day kind of slowly gets hotter and hotter, it's almost like that analogy of, is it a frog in a boiling pot of water? I can't remember.
That's what we say, yeah.
There you go. So, I mean, it's just the temperature slowly turning up on you so you don't notice it as much as if you stepped out of an air-conditioned home or car into hot weather. So there's a lot of things kind of conspiring against you that at Leadville can result in, 3-4 hours in, all of a sudden you're pretty hot. You didn't realize how you got there.
So the premise, I guess, of the idea of thermoregulation is not cooling down more or warming up more, but trying to stay at a correct temperature.
It is, but I think there's a couple ways to go about that. One of which is cooling down. Another is training the body to work better at a slightly higher temperature or to regulate its temperature better. So in the same way that you might come up with an altitude acclimatization or acclimation plan going to Leadville or any altitude location, you should probably do the same with heat. And so one of the things that we do with professional riders and professional athletes in other sports is when we know they're going to compete in a hot environment or one where heat will be a limiter, then we institute a plan ahead of time. So that might be training in heat. That might be exposing themselves to heat. Maybe they don't live in an environment where they can train in heat. So they go train and then they finish up and they hop in a sauna and make sure that they bring their core temperature up. Without boring you on all the details of the scientific literature, typically we want to see a core temperature of around 38.5 Celsius. I should be able to convert that. That's probably around 100 to 101 degrees. Don't quote me on that. But 37 would be 98.6. So it's about 1.5 degrees Celsius higher. And that's a hot feeling. So you want to spend some time in that thermoregulatory zone, that heat loading, so your body learns to deal with it, learns to sweat better, increases the serum volume so it can dissipate heat better. So there's the pre-process there, right, that you do before the race. And then there's the in-competition process of figuring out ways to cool yourself. So the ice socks that I think can be credited to Alan Lim back 15, 16 years ago, putting ice in the in a pantyhose stocking, tying it off and throwing it down the back of your shirt. Those are used because when the ice melts, you're basically carrying nothing. There's no weight penalty at that point. Anything from that to some newer techniques that we can get into as well.
If folks want a deep dive on heat training, we do have an interview and a whole episode devoted to that with Coach Chad. You should go back and listen to that. This show is going to focus more on cooling yourself off, especially in competition, but also during training and other times too, and when that is appropriate. And we're going to kind of focus in on 3 areas here regarding cooling, and that's during training, in the week of or leading into your event, and of course during the event, the biggie there. So, Dr. Sprouse, let's first talk about cooling ourselves off during training. Our standard, we're 3 months out, we're training, we're getting warm during our training sessions. There's a lot of thought that if I cool myself off quickly after a training session, I'm going to blunt all the gains I might get. I'm going to stop the overcompensation process that happens when I train. What's your thought on cooling after a training session? Should we be doing that, like purposely doing it with outside products? And if so, how should we do it?
I think it really depends. And that's kind of the answer to any deep scientific question, right? It depends on the scenario. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. It depends on where you're coming from, where you are in your training. But if we step back a bit, talking about the heat training, like we did a minute ago, that the acclimation or acclimatization process, if you're using your training to really improve your performance in a hot event coming up, you might want to stay a little warm. I kind of think of heat a lot like altitude, how you would address altitude. So, if you were going to compete at altitude and you had the opportunity to train at altitude, you would probably take it, right? Not for every event, not for every training session that you did, but you would have some where you train in that environment and then some where you don't. I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of sleep high, train low when you look at altitude. And the idea is you sleep high, so you expose yourself to that stressor of altitude at times when you're not exercising. And then when you train, you go low so that you can train hard, right? So you can still get good training. And so you can kind of apply that to heat as well. And there may be an opportunity to, on some sessions, spend most of your day in a hot setting, right? So in other words, don't cool off immediately after your training. In fact, maybe stay warm for the remainder of the day even. Not hot, but warm. And then have some sessions where you train focused on thermoregulation so you get really good training. And then some where you train hot. So I've often explained heat to athletes through the lens of altitude because altitude is something they're familiar at looking at this way. Only recently was I having a conversation with Dr. Aaron Bagish, and he was the one who kind of raised this idea. He's like, what about live hot, train cool? I was like, it's a great way to think about it. So I'll give credit there where credit is due. The point being, I think after a hot training session, there will be times where you want to stay hot, right? Not dangerously so, but half a degree to a degree core temperature elevation. And then there'll be times where you want to bring it down, cool things off for the purposes of recovery, sleep, etc. So it's kind of a multifaceted approach in that regard.
How are you measuring how hot you are, both during and after, right? Because, I look at my Garmin while I'm riding, and, I train alongside my wife, and she has a Wahoo. Our temperatures, what they're reporting on bike is almost always, 5 degrees apart, which is significant, right? And I don't have any sensor currently right now on me that is saying what my temperature is. Should I have one? And if so, what should it be? What's reliable, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I would look at this question like like any sensor on the bike. In other words, if you said, hey, I train with my wife, she's got a power meter, I don't, it doesn't mean you're just tanked. Like there's no chance of you doing well, right? In fact, with each added data point, there's probably some diminishing return, right? And I would look at it that way. You can take the overarching principles and apply them. And then if you feel like you're falling short a bit, you can start to measure and see where you are. For the recreational cyclists. For the professional cyclists, we're going to be much more dialed than that. But they're also, trying to maintain a career and get a paycheck and all those things. So it's a very different analysis, very different calculus, I think. It's funny how the head units from different companies and even within companies can be so different on something that seems so easy to measure, temperature, right? But I've seen it too. And that's just the ambient, outdoor temperature. There are things that you can get to measure temperature on you. So you can look at devices that measure skin temperature, which are going to be not that great for these purposes, but give you a little bit of directional guidance as to whether you're getting hotter. You can probably sense that though, right? You can get a device called a core temperature sensor. You've probably seen it. Maybe you haven't. It goes on your chest strap, and you can also stick it onto your side or whatever. And it's an interesting device. It's actually measuring your skin temperature in that area, but it's using the data from the heart rate strap as well as an algorithm that kind of has been trained to know what your core temperature would be doing given what it's seeing in the measurables, right? And it's a pretty decent monitor, as best I can tell in playing with it.
Is there one you like or that you recommend? Because I really have no idea.
That one is called Core, C-O-R-E.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was used a lot at the Tour de France last year. It was probably been out a little bit before that, but last year it kind of made a splash. And it's surprisingly decent. So that would be the one that's probably the best consumer model. The others that are used in more of a research setting or a professional level are like the temperature pills that you swallow, and they measure true internal temperature. Or if you are unlucky enough to sign up for a study at a university or something, you'll probably get a rectal probe. I don't recommend those recreational.
That falls outside the scope of this podcast at this point.
Yeah, and my practice.
Hey, Dr. Sprouse, I've long been an ice bath guy. I've used them, and I think with success too, depending on when I've used them. Also, the week of Leadville, I love to get in Turquoise Lake. I think it refreshes. I believe I'm controlling inflammation. I see athletes. We all see athletes jump into ice baths after their games or events or training. So when do you think is the appropriate time for us to get into a cold body of water to try and cool things down? And how cool should we be making things?
This is one that I think people often misuse, in my opinion. So the appropriate time, if you've just finished an event or a training session where you're properly hyperthermic, like your temperature is high enough that it's dangerous or uncomfortable or making you nauseated or really moving you toward heat illness, get in a cold body of water, get in an ice bath, bring your core temperature down. That's a therapeutic use. And there's nothing better for treating someone who's hyperthermic. From a performance standpoint, you mentioned earlier the idea of finishing a training session and then hopping into a cold plunge or a cold bath, ice bath. There is some thought that turning down or treating that inflammation blunts the training response. And there's probably something to that. I think you're probably starting to split hairs at that point, to the point that for most of us, that's not our limiter, right? That's not what's holding us back, is that we hopped in an ice bath. There's too many other things, but it wouldn't be an ideal way to utilize it. The thing that worries me, though, in that scenario is you're really shutting down blood flow, kind of a clamp, right? So when you get in a cold environment and you've got blood just pumping to muscles that are that have been used and are trying to kind of conceptually flush them, bring nutrients in, get waste products, if you want to call it that, out, and just kind of maintain that homeostasis, as well as other soft tissues, tendons, things like that. And you turn that off all of a sudden, I think you raise your risk of injury, not in the moment, but over long terms. Or if you're trying to deal with an injury, that may be a way that you slow healing, and that's well established. So I actually don't recommend that athletes finish training and hop in a cold environment of any type. I do like cold exposure though. And so I think it can be good at other times of the day, an hour or two after your training, if you're still feeling kind of hot and want to turn things down. The other thing it does is it gives you a nice kind of shot of cortisol, right? So even first thing in the morning, hopping in there and kind of using it to wake you up, not just psychologically, but physiologically, can be a really good tool. There's also some purported benefits of increasing brown fat and tan fat, which are two types of metabolically active fat that create heat and burn energy through the day. And they're good to have around, all other things being equal. So cold exposure may increase levels of those things in adults. So if you use it more either early in the day or a bit removed from your training, I think it's a better tool across the board.
So your stage racers, the EF guys, are doing what in between stages? Are they purposely cooling themselves down? Are they just letting their body take care of themselves?
We are actively coming up with lots of ways to address active cooling between stages. I think it's a huge thing for recovery, for sleep, for resilience day to day. We don't really have access to ice. It sounds silly, but from a logistical standpoint, we can't carry that much in the bus, and it can be really hard to find in countries in Europe. If you go to a hotel in France and ask for a bunch of ice, they're going to give you like a cup full, right? And you'll be lucky to get that. So it's a bit of a challenge. So what we do is we look for other ways that we can cool. Last year at the Tour de France was the first year that we took a device called the Cool Mitt. And well, I say it was the first year. It actually wasn't the first year. We took one of the previous iterations probably 8 or 9 years ago. But we took this newer one this year. And I probably wouldn't say anything about it because I think it's a nice secret weapon for us, except that it was on NBC. Like they showed it, and yeah. So it's no secret. But I think using devices like that, as well as ingesting cool liquids, gels, using cooling on the bus, cold shower afterwards. Like there's lots of ways that you can do it, but we do pay attention to it, put it that way.
Yeah, well, you're not revealing any secrets. I've been hearing about the cooling mitt for some time, and I think the news on it it started bubbling out of Stanford University around 2012, so it's been out there, and I've certainly heard it on several podcasts. Professor Craig Heller at Stanford has really focused in on where to cool the body. Not only that cooling works when somebody is trying to do exercise, but where on the body you want to try and cool a human being down. And Dr. Sprouse, they found there at Stanford that you're looking for hairless spots on your body. This is similar to the way a bear cools itself down, right? A bear has got all this hair on it, right? And that's great in the winter, but when it starts moving around in the summer, you would think that the animal would overheat and die. Well, it doesn't because, on its paws, it's got no hair, and it can use that area of its body to cool its core down. And humans, I guess we're pretty close to bears. I mean, we can use our hands to help cool ourselves down. So the question here is, how should we be cooling? When we do want to cool ourselves down and do it quickly, Dr. Sprouse, how should we be doing it?
Yeah, it's a important question to address because I think some of the strategies we've used in the past were probably either wrong or suboptimal. Where I went to medical school, there was also a veterinary school, and the vet students used to tell us that real doctors treat more than one species. So I can't speak to the bear analogy, but it sounds right. But in humans, there are 3 areas of skin: the palms, the soles, and the forehead, that we term glabrous skin. And in these areas, there are, one, no hair, and two, a vascular network that is specifically adept at dumping heat. So if you've ever noticed, if you're really hot and you put your feet in a cool pool, not even cold, but just like a swimming pool that is, 10 degrees cooler than the ambient temperature, you cool off pretty quickly, right? So using that same idea, the cool mitt, the device I mentioned, it circulates cool, not cold, because you don't want the vessels to clamp down. You want that blood flowing. Cool water, or cool environment under the palm. And according to Dr. Heller's research, it takes about 3 minutes of doing this to significantly drop core temperature. And a lot of this has been looked at in surgical settings, looking at when we put someone to sleep for a surgery, temperature regulation is really key to the anesthetic process. And so this is something that's closely measured. It's something that's closely regulated by the anesthesiologist. And we have a lot of data from that setting for this. And some of that's extrapolated to athletes. And then there's a growing database for using this type of technology in athletes. Most of it looks at in-between efforts. So like in the gym, doing a set of whatever, pull-ups, push-ups, squats. And then during the rest period, bringing your core temperature back down to take that governor off so the muscles can work at a higher rate subsequently. So you can imagine, we can't really use this on the road in cycling or on the trail, but you could use it beforehand. You can use it before a time trial. You can use it afterwards to bring their core temperature down. You might even use it before bed to start bringing the temperature down and induce sleep and deeper sleep. So those are some things that are being played with kind of widely. We actually used the old version of the Cool Mitt. It wasn't called that, but Dr. Heller's first device, like I said, 8 or 9 years ago. And it was not nearly as sleek as the current one. It was hard to travel with. I think we had it for either a Tour de Suisse or Tour de France. And it came out once and didn't make another appearance just because of the difficulty in using it. The new one is much easier to use, and I think you'll start seeing it more frequently in these settings.
Well, this gets us back to the ice sock that I handed up to an athlete and we see used all the time. Does that work? I mean, if the palm and the bottoms of our feet and our forehead are the place we should be trying to cool ourselves during activity, what's the sock down the back doing?
It's a good question, and I kind of have the same question myself. The more we learn about this, the more I kind of scratch my head in thinking about things we've done traditionally. You think about an ice vest that you see on someone before a time trial. There's the analogy of these things being more akin to putting a cold rag over a thermostat, right? And the idea there is, it feels cold, but the temperature turns itself up, right? The thermostat thinks it's too cold and it's got to create heat. And so if you put on an ice vest or put an ice sock down your back, then potentially your body is not effectively dumping heat because it's not in a place where you can do that well. And you're getting the downstream effect of feeling cold and your body conserving core temperature rather than dumping it. I think that's more of an issue with like an ice vest, less so with the ice sock. My thought with the ice sock is that it is probably ineffective if you were to measure core temperature, but it's subjectively effective. And that means something, right? So, I mean, we don't, as human beings trying to perform, so much of our rate limiting steps are psychological or just perceptual, right? And so I think the ice sock is useful to kind of take someone who's really hot and just make them feel a bit better. And I do think that probably improves performance.
Okay, since we're talking heat management here in the show, we should also talk about what kind of clothing is going to help you deal with the warming temps of the day. What jersey is going to be aero yet cool? Well, we think that jersey is one of DNA's.
It sure is. Any of DNA's jerseys are going to be great. They all have good moisture management fabric, But if you get your hands on the DNA's race day jersey with kite fabric, you're going to be that much better off when it comes to getting rid of heat. Kite fabric has a kind of mesh quality to it. So while it is definitely aero, you do get a little bit more venting. The mesh panels also mean this is a very light jersey, and light is good. You will always think about that when you're going up Columbine. Finally, the race day with kite fabric has a lower neckline, so you get a little more sun exposure. So that's great. Be sure to wear sunscreen.
Right. Unzipping your jersey works fine, but I hate doing that, especially on a mountain bike. And hey, you're going to have to zip it up eventually, so why not start with something that is going to promote cooling? And that's what the race day with kite fabric is designed to do. It may mean you'll need a vest to start the race, and DNA makes those, but by the time you're into the heat of the day, you'll be more comfortable. Check out DNA's race day jersey with kite fabric at dnacycling.com.
Let's keep that cool theme going. Again, thanks to the feed for lining up our guest and thermoregulation expert, Dr. Kevin Sprouse. When you talk about cooling, the thing I think about is about 80-ish miles into the Leadville 100 as you are beginning to climb on the pavement out of May Queen. There's usually a group of people who are handing out soaked wet rags that I have. I typically, if the day feels warm and I feel hot, I squeeze it right onto my head, which is getting to the forehead area, and the relief is tremendous. I think that there is a part of us that intuits what is effective and it makes us feel better. And, perhaps, getting to, or dumping water from a bottle onto my head seems like it makes a difference just by, cooling down that forehead. And, in my case, my whole head. So,
you and me both.
Yeah.
I think it's that. And in that specific scenario too, you increase evaporative cooling. So evaporative cooling is what your body is accomplishing with sweat. As something evaporates off your body, it takes heat with it. And so if you can spray yourself down with additional liquid that is going to evaporate quickly, then you can increase that process. So I think in what you're describing, the benefit's actually twofold.
I want to ask about the flip side. And this hasn't happened in a long time, but some of us will still remember the year 2000 when we had rain and wind and there was some sleet going up the power line and it became truly cold, right? Thermoregulation, of course, it's a two-sided coin. Besides, putting on a coat, if you have one, there is a possibility that Leadville can be very cold and is in the mornings for a lot of people. You can wind up heating yourself up too much by leaving a coat on too long, or you can wind up getting super cold and starting to, I have become sluggish and, not mentally sharp when I'm super cold. What is are there tips or advice that you would have for this, this alternate side of thermoregulation?
Yeah. And when you're competing in the mountains at any time of year, well, obviously in the winter, but even in the summer, it can just be cool and wet and you get cold very quickly. So it's a real threat.
Yeah. Any of us who have ever done a 24-hour event in the mountains know exactly how quickly it can go from a hot day to a very, very cold night.
The number one thing you would want to do is be able to layer up and dress appropriately. And I recognize that that's easier said than done when you're out there, but if it looks like there's a forecast that could lead to some cold weather, then having a jacket, having maybe a beanie that you can put under your helmet is going to be a small weight penalty, but a big boost for improving thermal regulation in that scenario. Gloves, the same thing. It doesn't have to be that you're carrying thick layers up there, but that you're getting the appropriate areas covered. So that would be number one. The other thing that I would consider, if you have someone who's supporting you, in hot weather, they can hand up very cold bottles, they can hand up ice gels, they can hand up, any number of things that are going to help bring your core temperature down. They can do the same on the flip side, right? So when it's really cold, we'll often get tea to our riders. A bottle of hot tea in a normal bottle, because it'll cool quickly. It's too hot to drink initially, but if you kind of have that for 5 minutes or so and get some internal warming, that can be really pleasant and also really effective.
And I wanted to talk about something that you brought up earlier, but I think that everyone can be guaranteed is the transition from very cold to warm, right? Between the starting line of the race and say by the time you begin the flats, from Pipeline to toward Twin Lakes Dam, you're going to go from it being pretty cold to being surprisingly warm on a typical day on the course. And you kind of hinted at there's a tendency to get rid of your layers too late in the game. That by the time you're like sensing that it's like, wow, I feel really hot. Maybe you should have, in the same way that if you wait till you feel hungry to eat, it's too late. It sounds like if you wait till you feel warm, it might be too late. When should we be delayering for smart thermoregulation, just in a typical race course day?
As a rider myself, I'm really bad at this. I like to be warm. I like to be comfortable, and do as I say, not as I do on this one, right? But if you'll look at the pros who line up for Leadville, a lot of them start off with puffy coats, a hood up over their helmet, big gloves, and they're warm in the corral before they start. And then right before they start, they take all that off, hand it to someone, and they're almost in the same thing they're going to wear for the rest of the time. They may have a light jacket on, but their clothing at that point is not enough to keep them warm standing there, right? And then they take off, and they're probably cool for the first maybe 5 minutes, and then the body heat's coming and they're warm. And I think they do that well. The rest of us could learn from that, because if it was me, I would start off in puffy coat, leg warmers, all this stuff, and feel great until about 15 minutes and then have to stop and take it off. A good rule of thumb is you should plan to feel cold for the first 5 minutes or so, knowing that you'll warm up. And if you kind of nail that, I think you're right in the right spot. There's a good chance that at the first or second aid station, you're going to be dumping a light coat, just a windbreaker, basically, handing it off. And depending on you may have arm warmers or not. There's all kinds of scenarios, but think about starting cold and dumping an easy layer at that first aid station, and you're probably going to do just fine.
Icy gels, slushies. We've seen, Dr. Sprouse, we've seen pros and others taking their nutrition products and cooling them way down almost to their ice. What does the data tell you about this? What are your athletes telling you about this practice?
It's a really good practice to the degree that you can logistically pull it off. It's hard to get very cold things out on course to a rider. So oftentimes you'll see them used before a time trial or a hot stage. As we were saying at Leadville, that's a little less pertinent because it's cold to start with, even on a hot day. But there was a study that got a lot of airtime just before the Beijing Olympics, where the Australia Institute for Sport looked at using slushies to bring core temperature down. And I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but maybe it dropped core temperature by 0.5 degree or a degree Celsius again. And it showed that over the course of an hour, those people who took the slushie in kept their core temperature lower. It was still going up, but it stayed lower than a comparable group. So the benefit was longer than just taking it in, right? It took longer for them to warm up. So the idea then is if you take iced products, again, an icy gel or a popsicle or whatever on course, that's a good way to bring core temperature down. And I think it's a very simple, elegant way to get core temperature down. You're putting ice into the core, right? Now it'll quickly melt, right? But that heat transfer is what you're looking for. Again, the difficulty comes with getting it out there and getting it to a rider and still being cold, because you've got minutes of taking it out of a cooler. Like you see the group coming and you're not sure where your rider is, and you've had the icy gel out for 3 minutes, and by the time you hand it to them, it's it's about normal.
The great thing about Leadville, Dr. Sprouse, is most of us will stop. So we have time to deal with riders who are overheating. As Fatty said, especially when you hit pipeline inbound, you've probably warmed up pretty good and you're hoping to cool yourselves off. So if you were in a pit, if you were a pit crew, if you were working alongside me and trying to cool off riders, give me a couple of things you might try to do that could be done quickly, that wouldn't take all day, to help an athlete cool down.
Pie in the sky scenario that is also able to be pulled off. I would say I'd have a slushy drink for them, right? And that can be whatever drink they like, scratch, that is frozen, pulled out a little early, shaken, just still icy. A frozen drink, maybe an ice gel if they like it, but get something cold inside them, get something sprayed on them, evaporative cooling. So that could even be, ideally, if you're at an aid station where you have a car nearby, which not everybody gets to, but there's a few little power sources and whatnot, having a fan with a spray bottle behind it, where you're just spraying water on the person, just causing that evaporative cooling to happen. And then again, if you happen to have a power source, if I was the one doing it and you could set up a cool mitt on the table, be drinking with the other, being sprayed with water, have my hand in that thing for 2 or 3 minutes and then hop back on the bike. That's how I would set it up for me. Again, the cool mitt's expensive, power's unlikely, so I recognize that's down the list of possibilities.
Could the athlete just hold something cool? Maybe you put a couple of ice packs in their hands obviously they want to do other things while they're standing there, but would that be a strategy that they could use, just hold something cool in their hands as they're in their pit?
The argument against that is if it's really cold, the vessels clamp down. You want them open and blood flowing so that heat gets transferred. So you could do something cool, but then it warms up very quick if you're holding it. You also create a layer. If it's a stagnant thing, like you hold a cold bottle, then you create a layer of warmth or warmer temperature between the bottle and your hand that stays stagnant. So the idea with something like the Cool Mitt, I don't own stock in this thing or anything, I'm just kind of telling you the purpose here, is that the cool fluid is circulating, so you never create that layer, right? So it's not to say that doing a different tactic wouldn't be worthwhile, but it stands to be ineffective or potentially even counterproductive if it kind of clamps down those vessels.
I have a question on return on investment for that. I mean, Hottie, our exchanges in the pit are 15 seconds or less. Is holding or, otherwise taking on something that is cold that's going to have me in the pit for a minute instead of 15 seconds. Is that going to pay me back more than 45 seconds in the rest of the race? Because it feels to me like I'm just wasting time if I'm standing there trying to cool down.
I think it depends on the day and it depends on the type of rider you are. So if it's hot and you're not going for the podium, but you're going for your PR, then it could absolutely pay off. If it is not very hot and or you're competing against a group and that group gets away, then that's a problem.
Well, Fatty, I know from feeding you, first of all, for the folks who are in White Corral who spend more time in the pit than, say, you do, I think it's absolutely something they should be at least thinking about. Like, can I take in a cool, instead of just drinking something, can I have my crew make sure that is a cold drink or even a cold gel? Could I take that in as opposed to just drinking, Leadville temp water, right? And for you, I think even for you, I know I hand you a drink when you come in every time. You always ask, make sure you have a drink for me, a cold Coke, something.
Love a cold Coke.
Something to drink while I'm standing there. That's one of your specific instructions to me. And I think one of our strategies might be, especially if it's warmish on the day, would be to hand you something colder than normal for you. And I think that's what we're getting at here. The cooling glove, that's for another budget, I think. Somebody who's sponsored, I'd love to have one out there and experiment it. Dr. Sprouse, if you're in Leadville this year, I hope you'll wave me down and say, here, you want to try the cooling glove? Because I'd love to check it out.
I'll provide the power source. I got that covered. But I do want to ask about, taking on or drinking something that is cold. A gel, I can't see this being a problem, but there have been times when drinking something really cold, when I am at, basically race tempo, my heart's really going. Of course, my stomach's always, just a little bit on the edge of feeling bad anyway. I drink something cold, and I mean really cold, ice cold, and I feel like I have a rock in my stomach all of a sudden. Like you talked about sort of a clenching thing. And I'm wondering, am I drinking too fast, too much, too cold? Is there a way I can get the benefit of cooling without, suddenly feeling like, I instead of drinking something cold, ate a rock?
I think with a lot of these topics around performance benefit in general, we tend to think of them as binary. Like you have to at least accomplish this to get a benefit. And that's not how the body works. And so if you in particular have a difficulty, guzzling something really cold, then obviously that's not an ideal strategy for you. So then what it may be is either raise the temperature a bit, decrease the volume, decrease the rate at which you take it in. I think any of those are legitimate, and you're still getting some benefit over having not done it. And the other thing for you in that setting would be look back at evaporative cooling. So, you like dumping the water on your head, right? So in that setting, have somebody there to hand you something cool, and it can just be a cold bottle that was just in the cooler. It doesn't have to be icy, but just something that's colder than you'd normally get. But have somebody spray you down, right? Whether that's with just a bottle, just spray you down, or if you've got some sort of hose device set up, pressurized tank, and just soak you. And that's going to go a long way and probably feel great as opposed to feeling like a rock in your stomach.
Hottie, you're going to have a Super Soaker 3000 at your pit.
I got you covered, man. I would love to do that.
Boom.
Well, Dr. Kevin Sprouse, we've learned a lot here, I think, on trying to stay cool, trying to cool ourselves down. So we want to thank you for cooling us off.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Again, thanks to Dr. Kevin Sprouse. If you would like to reach out to his team, check out podiumsports.net.
It's worth mentioning that Dr. Sprouse's segments on this program are brought to you by The Feed, which, by the way, has that cooling mitt we referred to in the show. Quite pricey, but The Feed has it, and The Feed also has a great program for our listeners.
Yeah, how would you like to get $80 to spend on any nutrition brand or product that fuels your training and racing? Right now, you can get $80 in annual credit at The Feed.
The Feed is the largest online marketplace for athletes to shop sports and nutrition, high-performance supplements, and recovery gear you need to make your workouts even better.
Yeah, so claim that $80 annual credit at thefeed.com/Leadville. You just register your email, you verify your phone number, and then you get to use your first Feed credit of $20 right away.
Okay, time to cool off from the show because another's right around the corner. Fatty and I are on social media. On Instagram, I'm at Michael Houghton. Fatty's on Strava. You can find his profile by browsing over to leadville.fm/Fatty. And of course, we are both on the Facebook Leadville 100 Mountain Bike Participants page. And if you want to have a deeper conversation, join our Slack channel. You'll find a link to it over at leadville.fm/Slack.
So good luck in your riding, your racing, your recovery, your cooling down. Thanks so much for listening. We're going to see you real soon at the starting line.